Sports Talk Chicago. Here for Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's a Blackhawks writer for NHL.com, former Cubs beat writer, and the author of The Franchise. Please welcome Bruce Miles to the program. Bruce, great to have you on. How are you?
Always great to be on with you, John. Busy times for sure. Hockey, baseball, everything going on. The World Cup, you name it.
It's great to have you here with me. What have you made of the Blackhawks season? First off, I see you're at the United Center right now.
Yes. Well, to me, it's going about as expected, and you hate to say it with the word tanking, but about as planned. They had a 4-game winning streak early on in the season, which I think surprised a lot of people. But I think they've come down to earth and found their level a little bit. They just don't have the firepower to compete with a lot of teams. They don't score a lot of pretty goals. Ever since DeBrincat was traded, they've got to work for the so-called greasy goals. And they've really been playing without their top 2 goaltenders, Stalock and Peter Mrazek, for much of the season because of injury. So Arvid Soderblom came up from Rockford and has done a creditable job, but he's really a guy who should be playing every night in Rockford of the American League.
How do you think they fix all of these problems? I assume time is going to be the main factor, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. I think that they just have to ride it up. The one thing I think they have going in their favor is that the players are responding to Coach Luke Richardson. He demands effort. The players give effort. Sometimes that effort is, not enough to make up for the lack of talent. So I think you'll see a lot as the kind of dog days after New Year's and into February where we'll see a little bit more about what this team is made of. But no, they're not going to make the playoffs. They're going to be playing for a top draft pick, and most fans seem to accept that.
What's your gauge on the Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews trade rumors, if at all? I know there's been a lot of talk about that even before this season up until today.
I think that those will heat up again as the trading deadline approaches after the first of the year. I think anything is possible. You could see both of them move. You could see one of them move, or you could see neither of them move because they both have no trade or no movement clauses, as they call them in the NHL. So I think everything and anything is on the table with that. It would be kind of a shame to see that because of what they've meant to this franchise, 3 Stanley Cups, the first rebuild. So, but I think anything and everything is on the table right now, John.
Do you think it'd be beneficial for them to make those trades? I mean, long term.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think maybe for all sides, if Toews or Kane gets to go play for a Stanley Cup contender, that would help them as well. The Blackhawks are in need of prospects, so I think that you can probably get 2 or 3 for each, depending on the team and the circumstance. But I think it would be a benefit to all parties if they were to be moved in the right situations.
What's your expectation for them for the rest of this year and then heading into the off season? I mean, are things going to get better between now and then?
Well, things will get better in the sense that they may improve their draft position, but I liken this a lot to the Cubs rebuild 2012 through 14. You understand what they're doing. You know why they have to do it. The problem is the games are just dreadful to sit through because more than likely it's going to be a loss. In the case of the Blackhawks, they don't score a whole lot. And it's just hard to watch, and it's hard for the people sitting here in the United Center to sit through that. So I just think it's going to be more of the same as we go on here.
When do you see them being good again? Do you have a gauge on maybe the year or the time or the frame in which they could be competitive?
I think they're looking at least one more rough year in the standings. After that, we'll see, depending. Some of it's luck, too, depending where you draft with a lottery, and you got to hit the right guy. I mean, again, I'll go back to the Cubs. If the Houston Astros had taken Chris Bryant instead of Mark Appel first in that draft way back when, we'd be talking about a different story with the Cubs. So you have to have a little bit of luck. A lot of it has to be by design, and I just think at least two more years.
Bruce Miles here on Sports Talk Chicago. Bruce, what's your take on this year's Baseball Hall of Fame ballot?
Well, I think that we're going to see perhaps no one elected on the BBWAA ballot. The closest guy, the closest holdover, whom I will vote for, is Scott Rowland. He needs to jump, I think, low double digits, 10, 11, 12 percentage points to get to that 75. Todd Helton is right behind him. There's no real what I would call obvious first timer like you might have had with a Big Poppy. So I think you may be looking at the BBWAA pitching a shutout this year. Fortunately, Fred McGriff is going to go in from the Modern Era Committee. He was elected just a short time ago. So I think you're looking at a shutout unless a lot of people change their minds and say, hey, we got to vote somebody in. Let's go with Scott Rowland.
Is there somebody specifically that you're really going to campaign for or support?
I don't really campaign. I'm a big ballot guy. I usually go for 9 or 10. You can vote for up to 10. You can vote for 0 if you want, but I'm a big ballot guy. I'm taking a look this year at Andrew Jones, who I've not voted for in the past. I'm taking another look at him. The so-called steroid guys fell off the ballot last year, and Schilling and Big Poppy was elected. So that opens up some space on my ballot. So I'm looking at him. I'm also looking at Carlos Beltran, who was on the ballot for the first time this year, certainly Hall of Fame numbers. Will that Houston cheating scandal impact that at all? And there's another guy that interests me quite a bit is K-Rod, Francisco Rodriguez, more than 400 saves. How do people view that? 62 saves in one season. For a stretch there, he was a pretty dominant closer. So I think in my mind, those are the guys that I'll be looking at very closely.
That's a great point about K-Rod. I've heard nobody really mention his name yet, but this is his first year on the ballot. The only other guy I could see on the ballot comparing to him would be Billy Wagner. You voted for him in the past, too. Do you think K-Rod gets one of your votes?
I think so at this point. I haven't made up my mind, but I'm leaning that way. I have voted for Wagner. I saw him a lot against the Cubs when he was with the Houston Astros when they were in the same division. I really do hope he gets in. I know he's been outspoken lately about, what is it? What do I have to do? I've got the numbers. Hard-throwing, small left-hander who was dominant for a stretch. So I'd like to see him get in.
Who else? Well, let me go back to Fred McGriff, actually, because you mentioned him. He got in on the Veterans Committee. You covered Fred McGriff with the Cubs. What's your take on that?
I'm good. I did not vote for him on the writer's ballot. I just didn't see him as the dominant player that others did, but I'm happy for him. Seemed to be a good guy, and I'm happy to see anybody get in. I'm, welcoming of that. I don't think that there's, people say, well, the Hall of Fame is being diluted. There's too many guys. Look at the percentage of the people in the Hall of Fame as to those who have played baseball over the years. So I'm all for anybody who gets in. I'll tell you another guy who's on the ballot that I vote for, and that's Mark Burley from the White Sox. I look at the stats, but I also look at what a guy meant to his city and the team that he played for. That's why I voted for Alan Trammell for all those years. He finally got on with the Veterans Committee. So I'm a Burley guy. Saw a lot of him, even though I covered the Cubs. I saw a lot of White Sox games, saw games he pitched against the Cubs. So I vote for him as well. I think that he'll get enough. He'll get at least 5% to stay on the ballot for another year.
How have you felt about the Veterans Committee not getting in a lot of those steroid guys this year, having Fred McGriff being the only one?
Very interesting. I was watching that one closely. That committee is made up of some Hall of Fame players, including Ryan Sandberg and Lee Smith, a number of executives, including Theo Epstein and Paul Beeston, who was with the Blue Jays when Fred McGriff was there, and I believe 3 media members, Susan Slusser and a couple of others. I was very, very interested in watching that. To me, a lot of the ex-players are against the steroid guys in any way, shape, or form because they feel that maybe they kept other players, out of a job or whatever. So I was very interested in that. And there's another thing with ex-players. They don't like a whole lot of people in their exclusive little club. That's why, Ron Santo for years had trouble getting in until finally they reconfigured it, and he did. So I was not at all surprised. I was maybe a little bit surprised that those guys, Bonds and Clemens, got fewer than, say, 4 or 5 votes.
You voted for Bonds and Clemens in the past. You've been for Sammy Sosa in the past, too. Do you think they ever all get into the Hall of Fame in some capacity?
I think perhaps that Bonds and Clemens do. The interesting thing for me with that whole dynamic was when Bonds, Clemens, and Sosa all went on the ballot in the same year, people talked about those 3 together and that their votes would be about the same and that would be a good bellwether. Well, what happened? Bonds and Clemens always had the same amount of votes. Sosa at some years barely stayed on the ballot. He nearly fell off the ballot one year, and I think it's because a lot of the voters felt that he was not a Hall of Famer before, if you believe, he went on steroids, and that Bonds and Clemens were Hall of Famers before the whole steroid thing started. So to me, that was the most interesting dynamic of that whole Bonds Sosa, Clemens. Whether any of them get in, I think maybe the committee will the makeup of the committee will have to change a little bit. Right now, it doesn't look good for any of the three of them.
Could that be a similar situation when you talk about Carlos Beltran, a guy who was to some considered a Hall of Famer? Then this last year, he gets hit with this allegation, with these problems with the Astros. Is that a similar situation to you?
I think it is with a different set of problems. Steroids are one thing, alleged cheating is another. It did cost him a managerial job. So we'll see what happens. The early vote tracking is in, but there's way too few public votes known right now to know how that's going. I think he's in the 50%. If you look on the Twitter site, not Mr. Thibs, Ryan Thibodeau, who does a nice job of tracking those votes. But that's going to be an interesting one to watch, to see how people view that whole alleged cheating thing. He certainly had the numbers in my mind to be in, and I'm leaning toward voting for him.
How do you compare sign stealing to PED use?
Well, it's an interesting thing. Sign stealing has been around the game since the game started. Now, if you're using enhanced methods like garbage cans or electronics to do it, I think that's where the line of demarcation is, where people said, you can whistle, you can clap your hands or whatever, or say curveball, and that's one thing. That's been part of the game for years. But this other stuff is, that's beyond the pale. The PED stuff, I think I'd draw the line probably at suspensions, or if you had a guy dead to rights. I mean, A-Rod, you look at him, suspensions, and he told so many lies that it just seemed like he even believed all the stuff he was saying. And so I think that's the difference there. I voted for Bonds and Clemens eventually after Bud Selig got in, because I think that Bud Selig profited more from the steroid era than anybody. So I got a little bit tired of the pearl clutching over the players when you had a commissioner who was pretty much ramrodded in the Hall of Fame, who stood to gain and did gain by the steroid era.
I noticed you also voted for Gary Sheffield last year, another guy who has some purported steroid ties. What do you think about his candidacy this season?
I think that I'll vote for him again. I'm not sure that he's ever going to get in or get the bump that he needs. People cite other things. I was talking with another voter today, as a matter of fact, and he cited Sheffield's defense. There's always the whispers about the steroids, as there were about Hall of Famers Mark Piazza and Jeff Bagwell and Craig Biggio. So if the whisper test doesn't go far enough for me, but I think that there's enough opposition to Sheffield that I don't think he'll get in.
Bruce Miles still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Bruce, a few more questions before we finish up. First off, the franchise. How'd this happen?
Well, the franchise is a book that I have written along with Jesse Rogers of ESPN here in Chicago. I was approached by Jesse and Triumph Books here in Chicago, and it's a series of essays or features about various aspects of Cubs history. And it's whatever we want it to be. I interviewed about 15 to 20 people. I talk about Sammy Sosa's legacy, why Kerry Wood was such a phenom and a phenomenon, the enduring popularity of the 1969 Cubs. And I even went way back in history and wrote about Gabby Hartnett's homer in the Gloman in 1938. The Cubs were kind enough to put me in touch with Gabby's granddaughter. So I interviewed her one day over coffee. So it's just a number of different topics that Jesse and I have tackled. It satisfied a need in me for history, to take another look at history, to satisfy my own curiosity, and to shed some new light on topics that we thought we knew about. I went back and talked with writers who covered Sammy Sosa with the White Sox. I talked to his former manager, Jim Riggleman. I talked with former Cubs general manager Jim Hendry about Aramis Ramirez, because we have a chapter in there about the eternal search for a third baseman between Ron Santo and Aramis Ramirez. So it kind of, I wanted to shed new light on some old subjects and satisfy my own historical curiosity.
I'm curious, what did you learn about Gabby Hartnett's homer in the Globe? And I've read that so many times in history books over the years. Did you learn anything different or something that we don't know about it?
Well, had that game been called on account of darkness in 1930, it would have had to have been replayed in its entirety the next day or some other day after that. So there were no suspension rules then. It would have ended as a tie game and would had to have been replayed. What really piqued my curiosity or my interest in that is it's unfortunately a forgotten home run in history. We think of Kirk Gibson and Carlton Fisk and Joe Carter and Bill Mazeroski, all these famous home runs. That one rates barely a blip in history, and I think it's a darn shame because it was so important. It didn't win the pennant for the Cubs, but it set them on their way a couple days later to win it. So I think it's a forgotten home run in history, and just think if there were social media, perish the thought, in those days. So it's just one of those things that piqued my curiosity, and those are some of the things I kind of got out of it.
What was your favorite excerpt or essay or topic to write about in this book?
I think it was probably either the Sammy Sosa or the Kerry Wood chapter, simply because I lived both of them. My first year on the Cubs beat was 1998. That was the year of the Sosa-McGuire home run chase. That was Kerry Wood's 20 strikeout game in his major league debut, and the Cubs won the wild card. So I wanted to tell some stories there and take a narrative approach to some of it, of just what was going on that season. So I got to believe that those two chapters for me were my favorites, simply because I lived them and kind of wanted to relive them again while shedding some new light on it.
Bruce, before we finish up to that last question, what's the most memorable moment of Cubs baseball you witnessed?
Well, in person, I always say that to me, I always put aside 2016 winning the World Series. That's a special category in and of itself. I mean, there's nothing that will ever match that for anybody who waited to see it and then lived through it. So I set that one aside because it's so obvious, but I've always said that Kerry Wood's 20 strikeout game for me is my favorite because he was not quite 21 years old. There were only 15,000 people in the ballpark on a kind of a damp, dank, dreary day, and he was so dominant. I talk with players and they said the ball moved like a wiffle ball, and the only hit of that game was by Ricky Gutierrez, who joined the Cubs a couple of years later. It was an infield hit that Kevin Ory, the third baseman, couldn't quite get to. Some people thought it was an error. Well, a year or two later, Ricky comes to the Cubs in spring training. That game's on the clubhouse TV, and Ricky walks by and goes, "I got a hit off of that. Sorry, so-and-so." So there's so much about that game, and that Kerry and I have always had a good relationship. And in 2018, on the 20th anniversary of that game, we sat down and we had a nice talk about it. So, and Kerry says that was a base hit all the way. He and the official score that day since talked, and they said, yeah, everything is good. And Kerry said, I agree with what you did. So that game for me is still the best.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for joining me. Best wishes, of course, covering the Hawks and with this Baseball Hall of Fame vote, and looking forward to always staying in touch and having you on again very soon.
Yes, if there's sports, I'm probably around it.